Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I think it's an interesting conference, and building on innovation is something we all have to be engaged in. And one of the things that I've learned over the years in the situation I'm in, that I can go in very different places. I sometimes describe myself as a vacuum cleaner. I suck up all kinds of ideas all over the places where I come and try to share that with other people. What I want to do is describe an innovation development, that a movement that we've done in the Netherlands over the past almost 10 years that builds on what we call meta-evidence. I think our field is overburdened with detailed evidence, and that we use not enough of the large knowledges that we have in our field. So meta-evidence is what we really know, what will not change by the next publication, next week or next month. And I always start with the idea that mental health issues are rather prominent. If you have a population of 100%, half of the people might develop a mental issue over their life course. That's huge. And one of the interesting part of that, of important parts to realize, I've always worked with people with severe mental illness, and that's kind of safe. But if you look at the prevalence of mental illness problems, all the burdens are huge. A light depression takes out quality of life of people for months. So there's no way to say that there's only a priority in severe mental illness, or that there are parts of burden that you could neglect from a systems point of view. If you look at the prevalence at a specific year, it's 1 out of 4. If you look at the Netherlands, where we are able to almost offer care, professional care, to 8% of the population each year, this is extreme. But there's a huge difference between the actual burden and the needs. And when you look at severe mental illness, and we use a different kind of definition of severe mental illness in the Netherlands are people who are in need of integrated care, where the burden of functioning and mental problems are intertwined, and where you cannot provide care in just one of the dimensions. And of course, all kinds of challenges in society changes those figures, and it doesn't improve in that direction. So what are the first issues to think about? So one of the first things that we have to realize is how we manage those needs on society base. Another issue that we are thinking about is mental illness is a huge international crisis. If you compare it with somatic illness, we're not doing such a good job. Somatic burden is decreasing over the years. In psychiatry, it stays the same, and those are the optimistic people. And other people will say, no, it's increasing. The burden increases over time. And so one of the challenges is, what should we do to have an ambition and decrease that? And basically, it will not help to find double therapists who do trauma treatment. From that point of view, you will never change this kind of figures. So that's something to think about. The ambition is basically an ambition that you could define as sustainable developmental goals. And that means try to reduce the burden of mental illness by 1/3. 25% now, yeah, 1/3 less. Also, severe mental illness is not only important to reduce the light cases, but you have to reduce it all over the spectrum. You want to reduce suicides by 1/3. You want to increase social participation by 1/3. You want to reduce the life expectancy gap for severe mental illness by 1/3. And you want to increase and improve how people participate in life and are not stigmatized. And basically we should do that with the budget that society allows us to use. Optimistically, 1% of GNP. And how can we be more ambitious as a sector? Of course, we have a lot of discussions about quality of direct care. Over the years, we have thought that the whole system only defends itself because it's too expensive. And that takes out a lot of the creativity in the sector. Recently, we've also become aware of the fact that it's not only the system that has to work, but that people working in the systems and the people who take care in society for people with mental illnesses should also be helped, because we're not keeping people in the sector. And finally, we have to think about health equity. We have to think about a system that is honest and develop that way. Prioritizing, making it sustainable, and think about human rights. One of the things we have to think about is, where does that money go at this moment? And a lot of money goes to the mental hospital. I've worked for 20 years in mental hospitals. I was always convinced that in the mental hospitals are the heroes that take care of the most severe ill patients. Over the years, I started to understand that that's not true. That the same kind of needs exist in society, in people. And that often we don't manage that very adequately. And we think that the hospital is the security for the whole system. We have to be aware of that. Often, and I was the head of a closed ward, often the most difficult patients are more easy to manage in society than in the hospital. That's a paradoxical observation. And so we have to be aware of that, because it has to do with how we spend our money and where we can free up our resources to build a better system. And that better system is a social system, a public system, not only a professional system. One of the things to think about is how professionals function and how professionals think about their role. Because most of the professionals hope to be the fixers of illness. That's their identity, basically. And that's understandable. That's basically what you think that matters. That's also what you think that improves your expertise, is by being a specific expert for a specific domain. I just consulted last week in a new program, and they thought that they had to develop a real important need in society. and that was a new program for people with autism and personality disorder. And so you could say, and why not for each of the different personality disorders, another expertise and another center? It ends nowhere. But it is the idea that we become experts that way. And so we have to think about those issues because also the client and the family expect this kind of expertise. So we really have to think about the role we have and the fundamental idea of expertise in our sector. And that's not the detailed expertise, but that's the relational expertise, the expertise of what it means for people to engage in a situation. All the sheets will be shared, so there's a lot of information, but all the sheets will be shared. In that discussion about that culture change part, perception of society is linked to the CRPD notions, which basically redefine our tasks from a role in optimal care to a role in helping people being able to live normal lives. And that's a huge shift because it has to do with how we refocus our attention. And that refocusing of our attention gives new opportunities that basically will lead to better lives for people. The fact that CRPD is so important, even in countries as the Netherlands. I just gave you some examples. It's 3 months ago, a mother of an autistic psychotic patient came to me. She took care for her son for the last 15 years. Did his grocery shops, cleaned, cooked for him, and invested in the fact that her son can live in society. Now that son was taxed for 35,000 euros because the government thought that they had given him money that he didn't need. This is a crucial aspect of discrimination. This is a crucial aspect of not understanding what we need when we intend that people in a public field engage in participation together. If we're not able to solve those issues and only the CRPD can help us making this kind of choices, it's important to change the way we develop a mental health system. It has to do with normal things in life. So good mental health and mental health development has always to do with a political engagement. I hoped for years it wasn't necessary. I hoped for years I could stick with my own professional aspect. What is important? It's important to realize that developing mental health is always a process, not something that you fix. Mental illness, by definition, is an episodic disease. That's true for the classic episodic diseases as psychosis and bipolar disorder. But it's also true for anxiety, depression, even for autism. It goes up and down. And as a society, but often also as a professional, we're not used to think about the consequences of that episodic aspect. We're used to think about disabilities as being stable, or as disabilities as being linear, only evolving in one direction, as in dementia. the way you provide care in this kind of situation is that if you have a stable disability, you can do an assessment and design the way you adapt the world or design how you develop a skill development. If it's a linear degenerative disease, each assessment that you do will probably be the best possible situation and will worsen in one direction over time. Fundamentally, in mental illness is an episodic disease, which means that nothing that you do is a stable solution over time. It's totally dynamic, and that means it should be, by definition, interactive. That's the only way to provide that. So building on change, it's always building on learning processes. It's not providing a cure, but it's helping developing for people. People should become more resilient. You should avoid and try to avoid that they become more vulnerable over time. And that has consequences. And that process is basically a little bit more difficult for one person compared to another. And that's a part of empathy that we have to use in that process. Another issue that we often don't understand, almost everyone accepts the vulnerability stress model as a heuristic of understanding those processes over time. But if you think about that, people have a certain, it's difficult to point here, but people have a certain threshold where changing stress over time leads to symptomatology or leads to periods of no illness. The real thing is that that threshold changes over time. And that's the part of the process of care. And that change over time makes the threshold going down through all kinds of situations as being fired on the job, maybe a death of a parent. All kinds of situations can create that increasing vulnerability over time. But at the same time, also all kinds of situations can help building resilience. And those are the normal things that help building resilience. And mental health interventions are only small parts of that. So we have to realize that we cannot have a system that insufficiently helps people when we think that the system only has to rely on our technical interventions. This is stupid to design it that way. So basically, we have to think about domains that might be interesting to explore in that life of people. And those domains, I use the reference of positive health, where there are 6 domains that have been developed there. Symptomatic domains, I'll use the next one. Symptomatic domains, somatic symptoms, psychological symptoms. There's participation domain, where you have daily life functioning and social integration. And you have personal recovery domains, where you have meaning in life and quality of life. And those domains are supplementary. Our system is often designed in a way that we first do the first domains, the symptomatic domains, and later go on in rehabilitation and participation. And if that doesn't work, the user groups can help people out because they're desperate anyway. So there's a sequential design in our system. While the real issue is that that it's an interactive system with parallel tracks on different life domains. And that is how we have to design it. I had patients who were admitted 5 or 10 times a year, And at a certain psychotic patients with a psychotic episode, and at a certain moment in time, they didn't came to the hospital anymore. And sometimes you worry and you think that you might have missed a suicide. But I had a number of patients who said to me, I started a relation. A friend gave me a job. So those things are so important, but are not part of our ecology, not part of what we think about. While we still say we know recovery is important, we know that recovery is a winding road, optimal care is speeding up a little bit in its process, not frustrating that process, being able to develop that process. Even more, designing shortcuts on that process will not help because you don't have the opportunities to learn then. So it's important that it takes its time. It's important that the process is not only the resources of mental health, but it's the resources of life. That's what we have to do. Because also in recovery, the journey is more important than the destination. We know those slogans, but we don't design the systems using this kind of issues. So what's important? How can we increase that resilience? Shared decision-making is an important issue. You need the input of the person. You need the input of the person's environment to develop that. And so that process over time is an iterative process. It's a process of a continuing dialogue over time. And you have to design that continual dialogue over time. That continual dialogue over time basically has to start from the idea that what is important is to learn together. And so it's important that you try things out and that you can learn together and that you can fail in trying out. But that's the exploration that you want to do. We've designed a number of questions that can help in that process. What happened to you? What is your vulnerability? What is your strength? What do you want to achieve? What do you need? Maybe what have you tried? Although that's not that important. Why? Because something that you tried 1 year ago and failed can perfectly work 1 year later. So engaging in that is important. And so the real question is, what do you think is worth trying to explore? While our health system basically is based on an intake where we select people for our technical interventions, this is changing things and exploring what is worthwhile exploring. The first questions are relation-related. The next questions are the center part of shared decision-making. And so the crucial discussion is that the ecosystem for mental health should be a system of open opportunities, not a system of scarcity of our professional resources. Because we've designed mental health very often as a stepped care system where non-response leads to more specialized interventions. And basically, we designed in hopelessness because your options become less and less over time. You become desperate in this design. But that's design of our professional system. And we have to discuss that. So the real idea is that we open up opportunities and that the whole ecology of or living environment become the resources for exploring your pathway to recovery. And that's very crucial. Once again, it's worthwhile exploring. It's never helpful to wait for 3 months for a solution in mental health. It's stupidity. Well, people wait for a year or 2 years to hear that they will not be admitted because of another reason. That's creating hopelessness. And so basically, all community resources are relevant in our system. How can we activate those community resources? The first issue is straightforward. Our idea in society about people with mental illness is the idea of stigma and the fact that we think that we are unable to help because it is something that has to occur in the specialist environment, which is basically the most stupid thing that you can imagine. Because if it's true that 1 out of 2 has a mental issue over his life, and 1 out of 4 has a mental issue today, I cannot imagine someone in each country who doesn't engage daily with people with mental illness and feels very often able to act, skilled. So once again, it's a perception idea that we don't have resources. It's important to think about how to engage this kind of resources, because often in the discussion, and I make the triad as a reference, discussion between family as the public resources, the client, and the professional resources, it's often a design of 1 or 2 against the other. That's not very constructive. So what you want to have is a dialogue with those kind of issues. And I will stop with the next slide. The idea there is not that the resources are the providers of care, what we often think, but the environment is basically the environment that provides identity. And that creates a reciprocity. And I think building this kind of dimension will lead us to a new public mental health that will be much better for people. Thank you.